Good afternoon. I'm Kate Christian from the psychology department. Thanks for being here today at our psychology speaker series. Good to see you all. Today we have speaking for us Dr. Priti Shah, who holds a PhD in cognitive psychology from Carnegie Mellon and who is the department head at the University of Michigan Psychology Department. So please give her a warm welcome.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about ADHD, and I first wanted to start off by saying thank you for coming and thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. You're more than welcome to ask questions during the middle of my presentation. Doesn't even matter if we get through all of it, as long as you find it entertaining and interesting. So just feel free to jump in and ask questions anytime. So I'm going to start off with this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. And it says, I've got a great idea for school tomorrow. I cut a ping pong ball in half, and now I'm drawing dots on each end. I'll just put one over each eye, and it will really look like I'm paying attention. Or will I look too interested? I doubt it. I'm over here. So he's looking the wrong way. So Calvin is sort of an example of someone with ADHD. And two things that we're going to talk about that you'll notice today in the talk and sort of about the science underlying ADHD. One is that he has trouble paying attention in the classroom, right? His mind wanders, he's thinking about something else. And he's worried about being able to pay attention in the classroom. And the second issue is that he's very creatively trying to come up with a solution, right? Like, you know, it's using ping pong balls to try to look like he's paying attention. So those are two things that we're going to talk about today, both mind wandering and attention issues, but also potentially some of the strengths that are associated with ADHD. Okay, so ADHD is a common childhood disorder, and it's characterized by inattentiveness, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. And in 2022, 14.4% of children ages 13 to 17 had a diagnosis of ADHD. And you'll see that the sort of rate of diagnosis has been going up over time. It's not really clear. It's probably unlikely that this is because there is more ADHD, but there's more awareness of ADHD and more sort of choice. People choose to get diagnosed in part because there are treatments that they can access and other things. So it's a pretty common disorder. And about 6% of adults have ADHD. So a lot of kids grow out of their ADHD, but about 6% of adults have been diagnosed with adult ADHD. So ADHD is associated with lots of negative outcomes. So for example, students with ADHD often have academic difficulties, social difficulties, poor self-regulation, and distractibility. So by self-regulation, I mean the ability to do things like, you know, sit still when you need to sit still, or decide, you know, plan an activity, sort of like I need to do my homework first and then I need to go out, things like that. So that's basically characterization. And with adult ADHD, most people with adult ADHD have primarily inattentive ADHD. And that's basically sort of ADHD without the hyperactive component. So some of the characteristics of people with adult ADHD are things like failing to give close attention to details, making careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention, doesn't appear to listen, struggles to follow instructions, has difficulty with organization, avoids or dislikes tasks requiring sustained mental effort, loses things, is easily distracted, is forgetful in daily activities. So just keep in mind that even if you don't have ADHD, it really is sort of a continuum, right? Everyone sort of sometimes forgets where they parked or forgets where they put their keys, or has trouble focusing on something that's boring to them, right? So it's not like everyone who has these characteristics has ADHD, but if you have them in the extreme. And then another characteristic or sort of defining feature of ADHD is that you have to have had those symptoms before age 12. Okay, primarily hyperactive ADHD involves things that involve not being able to sit still. So, fidgets with hands or feet, has difficulty remaining seated, runs or climbs excessively. So, in children, they might run around, but in adults, tend not to run around, but they might be restless when they're trying to sit in a lecture hall. They have difficulty in engaging in quiet activities. They sort of feel like they're driven by a motor. They don't want to stop. Talk a lot, blurt out answers to questions, difficulty waiting or taking turns, or interrupts or intrudes upon others. So those are some of the characteristics of the hyperactive form of ADHD. And then there's a combined form of ADHD, and that's basically having both inattentive and hyperactive symptoms. So, ADHD can have a lot of impacts on your life. So, you can imagine that it has an impact on your just daily tasks, right? Whether it's doing your homework or making sure that you know where you've parked, or, you know, planning the steps to going to the grocery store, forgetting that you didn't buy all the ingredients you need to make dinner. So those are the kinds of daily tasks that we're talking about. It can also have an impact on social relationships, which you might not necessarily think about, but I, as someone who frequently does things like I left my wallet at work yesterday, and so then I had to call the friend that I was meeting to say that I would be late because I had to go back to get my wallet. And so, that can be kind of tiring to people who are around people with ADHD, right? It's a little frustrating to have someone late. My friend was very gracious about it, thankfully. But that can be outcome is that people have difficulty with social relationships. May also have difficulty keeping with healthy behaviors such as exercise, nutrition, and good sleep, right? So if you're impulsive, you might just be hungry right now and decide to eat a piece of cake. So that type of impulse control issue can translate to not doing things that you have to do to stay healthy, because you're sort of deciding to do something different. And impulse control also leads to things like addiction, substance use, infections, and injuries, right? So if you're kind of gonna climb something, I'll give you another. I actually don't have ADHD, but I apparently have some of the symptoms of ADHD. But something like, I want to put up my curtains right now and there's no one here, but I'm still going to climb on the back of the couch to do it. That would be an example of impulse control having an impact on your potential health. I stopped myself and decided I would wait till someone was around, so in case I fell off the couch, that there would be someone to know. So that's kind of how ADHD can have such a broad impact on your life. And psychologists believe that some of the underlying problems with ADHD are associated with two things: executive functions and attentional control. They're kind of related ideas. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what executive functions are. How many people have heard of executive functions already? So lots of people have heard of executive functions. You can help me through this. You've probably seen some of the tasks that I'm going to show you. So executive functions are the cognitive mechanisms that support the control and regulation of thought, action, and emotion. And so they tend to be activities that are governed by the frontal cortex, and in particular, the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And there's kind of, psychologists have divided up executive functions into what you would call cool executive functions and hot executive functions. So a cool executive function would be something like working memory, the ability to keep track of something like a phone number in your mind, and then go dial the phone number, or to keep track of the numbers in a mental math problem, like 27 times 32 is, let me see, 7 times 2 is 14. Okay, carry the 1. I forgot what the numbers were, right? So that's basically a task that requires working memory. Inhibition is the ability to stop responses that are kind of automatic. That would be something like you always take the same route home from work every day, but then today you have to stop at the grocery store, but you don't do that because you're so used to following a particular path. Interference resolution involves things like ignoring background noise or ignoring irrelevant information that's not relevant for the task. And then finally, cognitive flexibility is the ability to kind of switch gears, switch from one thing to another. So those are kind of characterized altogether as cool executive functions. And hot executive functions are also control and regulation of thought and action. There are things like emotion regulation, sort of like you might be feeling anxious, but you kind of have to suppress that anxiousness while you're taking a test. Delay of gratification, that would be the ability to sort of stop yourself from doing something pleasurable in the moment and delaying that pleasure, like being able to go out with your friends when you're supposed to be studying. And impulse control, doing things like stopping yourself even though you're really excited and you want to raise your hand or speak out, but you're supposed to wait. So those are basically executive functions in general. And you can see how they're so important for lots of things. So suppose that someone's taking a math test and she's working on this problem. Alex and Sam build tables. Together, they make 10 tables in 12 days. Alex working alone can make 10 in 3 days. How long would it take Sam working alone to make 10 tables? Is it not most people's favorite kind of math problem? So she's got to engage in a lot of executive functions while she's doing this, right? So she's got to ignore the teacher who's talking to another child because she's got to be focused on that math problem. She's got to keep in mind what the goal is while still juggling things like the partial products of the calculations that she's doing. And she's got to switch around. She's got to focus on translating the equation to number, the words to numbers, so setting up the equation, multiplying, adding, dividing. So that kind of requires that cognitive flexibility or task switching. She's also got to engage her hot executive functions, right? So she's got to keep working so she can go to recess. She's got to try again, even if she's frustrated and stuck. And she's got to avoid temptation, like talking to a friend. So it's not surprising that these executive functions are so important for lots of things. And this is just some graphs showing the correlation between executive functions on the x-axis and various academic outcomes like reasoning, vocabulary, math, and reading. And you can see that the higher people's executive functions are, the better their academic outcomes are. But you have to keep in mind that executive function capacity is limited for everyone. And you may have already done these tasks, but it could be fun. So how do we know? First, we're going to try a task that shows us how quickly our working memory can be challenged. The digit span task. Who's done the digit span? Okay, well, this is an easy task. In the digit span task, participants view a series of digits one at a time and then recall them in forwards or backwards order. So in the forward span, you might hear 374 or see 374, and then you recall 374. In the backwards version, you recall them backwards. So if you hear 928, you have to respond 829. So, okay, let's try it with 3 items. When the screen says recall, please say out loud the digits in the order you saw them. Ready? Everybody ready? Okay. Okay, very nice. Okay, so now we're going to try a backwards one with 9 items. Okay, you ready for that one? All right, you got to really focus on this one.
82795.
You can see how that one is significantly harder. I don't think there was 9 numbers. I think I must have messed up. But But nonetheless, it was pretty challenging. Just the act of trying to reverse them in your mind and keep track of everything is hard in and of itself. And then the more information you have to hold is really hard. So working memory is highly limited, and everyone suffers from working memory limits. And lots of things can impact your working memory. And I'll explain how ADHD might do that in a few minutes. So your capacity is quickly overwhelmed. I'm going to show you another kind of task. This is an inhibition task, and you may have done this task. It's a lot of fun. It's called the Stroop task. And in this task, in the first set, I'm just going to show you little color patches, and you're going to name the colors. All right, and we'll go kind of quickly. So just say out loud the color of the square as fast as you can.
Blue, yellow, green, purple.
Okay, this time I'm going to ask you to just say the color of the ink out loud, even though the words are going to be written. So if you see blue written in red ink, you're going to say red. You got it?
Purple, green, yellow, blue, red.
Okay, so that task is hard. Can someone explain why that task is so hard? Right, because you're reading it. Reading has become kind of automatic. When you see a word, you're like, your brain reads it. And then you have to suppress that and focus on the color. You're not used to naming colors. You don't go around the world going, that's blue, that's green, that's yellow. You go around the world reading things all the time. And so, why does ADHD impact executive functions? One possibility is that they struggle to control their attention, right? So if you're not able to focus on those numbers while they come up, you become distracted while those numbers come up, then you're not going to remember them, obviously. So mind wandering impacts your ability to keep track of information, ignore distractors, avoid impulsive behaviors. If you're not thinking about the task, you are very likely to keep driving instead of stopping at the grocery store. You kind of have to keep rehearsing. I got to go to the grocery store. I got to go to the grocery store in order to make sure that you stop on the way home. Okay, so you can think of attention like a lens where there's a narrow focus, average focus, and a wide focus. And the modulation of attention is crucial for many tasks. So you have to both inhibit or ignore irrelevant information and also at the same time attend to important, new, different information, right? So you don't want to be paying attention to too much, let's say, because there's a lot, you can't hold all of that stuff in mind. So you want to suppress it. So you don't want to think about, while you're taking a math test, you don't want to think about your date tonight. You want to just focus on the math test. But you also need to focus on the whole task. And sometimes that might mean that while you're doing the math test, you also have to keep an eye on the clock. And so that means that you can't just be so narrowly focused that stuff that you need to kind of monitor now and then doesn't come to mind. So you can see how you really need to control your attention. And attentional control limits can have some impact. So with a wide focus of attention, you pay attention to too much. You're distracted by things outside the intended area of focus. You pay attention to reading the words instead of kind of suppressing that. And this is problematic in some ways because it's inefficient to a single task. You can't focus, you then aren't able to do the task. But in my lab, one of the things that we talked about is perhaps there's some positive things associated with having a wide focus of attention. And maybe sometimes you're really able to do some tasks better than people who don't have ADHD. And so we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to show you some data about how ADHD is actually associated with higher levels of creativity. You could also have a laser beam, too small focus. You pay attention to one thing at the expense of everything else. And negative outcome, you may lose track of time while you're doing that math test. You might forget about obligations, like I have to, stop at 3 o'clock and do this. But there may also be a plus that we've studied in my lab, which is being hyper-focused or super-focused, so that you can really just practice that piano piece over and over and over again and get better and try and ignore everything else in the world. And so there might be some benefits associated with that as well. So I want to share some of the data that we've collected to show that both of these potentially positive outcomes, you'll see that being super focused is not necessarily always positive, but it can be positive. Are there any questions so far? Yeah.
Are there studies that show, like, I know those associated with ADHD, but how much do those are affected by trauma as well? The hyper focus or the too focused because of what you're used to dealing with and having to pay attention. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there's been a ton of studies
Yeah.
on that, but telling the difference between ADHD but this is also your trauma.
So I'm not a trauma expert. I'll start with that, but I will say that anything that kind of causes you to think about other things and or practice avoiding those things are going to have an impact on your ability to attend to information, which is why not everyone who struggles with attention might have ADHD, right? So as an example, if you have high anxiety, you're going to exhibit a lot of the same symptoms as someone with ADHD because you're going to be thinking about other things. And that's basically not being able to control your attention. You may also be super hyper-focused because you've just tried to avoid thinking about certain things. So either one of those are possible as well. And so, the symptom of this sort of attentional regulation problems is not only due to ADHD. So someone might be depressed and show those symptoms. Someone might be sleep deprived and show those symptoms. There's lots of ways in which your attention can be impaired outside of officially having ADHD. Any other questions? Yeah. Well, literally brain maturation is one explanation for that. So the prefrontal cortex is the latest part of your brain to develop, and some people's everybody's brain develops at a different rate. And your sort of maximum peak prefrontal function is around age 20. So it's possible that someone was slightly delayed, and this is true often that people may be diagnosed with ADHD, but like 2 years later, they're absolutely fine. They just grew up a little bit. And so you might be a 6-year-old who really has trouble sitting still in the classroom, but when you're 8, you're just fine. So that's why some people grow out of it. Any other questions?
Is it strange then that we have so many adult diagnoses in ADHD? Like they didn't get diagnosed as a kid, but are getting diagnosed as adults?
Yeah, so I mean, not everyone sort of grows out of it, and I think that a lot of people my age weren't diagnosed as children, especially women, because most women have the inattentive kind of ADHD. So if you're just quietly sitting in the classroom, maybe your teacher doesn't really notice that you're not paying attention or you're distracted or whatever. And then you start noticing in your adulthood that maybe you do have some of these symptoms. And so that is probably why people are more likely, or some people are becoming diagnosed even though they weren't diagnosed as children. But a neuropsychologist won't diagnose you unless you say that you also had the symptoms when you were younger. Yeah.
They're outgrowing it or more just cope with the symptoms? Until now, I was under the impression that you can't really outgrow it. It just kind of, you learn to cope with it, you deal with the symptoms in your own way, and some people are able to get to a point where they seemingly don't experience the symptoms, but they're really just coping with them, and others continue to struggle with them?
So there's actually both. It turns out, for example, that one of the cures to ADHD is a tonsillectomy. Does anyone know why that would be? I know, right? I mean, not everyone can get cured from ADHD with a tonsillectomy, but if you have sleep apnea due to enlarged tonsils and that affects your sleep, so if you have enlarged tonsils and you're a child and you're diagnosed with ADHD, one study actually at Michigan Medicine found that 50% of kids are no longer meet the eligibility criteria for ADHD if they have a tonsillectomy. So there's definitely kind of a biological element that you can possibly change, whether it's prefrontal development or tonsils being too big. But there's also strategies that people can develop, as you said, to cope with ADHD. And one of the successful treatments of ADHD is learning these different kinds of strategies. And so absolutely, that can also look like you don't have ADHD anymore. You're just going through the world using compensatory strategies. Yeah.
Wouldn't that then be a false diagnosis? They don't actually have like a neurodiversity or actually have ADHD, they just have sleep problems, or they have a bad home life, then they're acting out because of that. That wouldn't actually be ADHD, so they wouldn't be outgrowing it, they would just be fixing a problem in their life.
Yeah, I see what you mean about that. It's just that they were diagnosed by some doctor with it, even though maybe technically they didn't have it, or that they had a different cause of it. And there's sort of a debate as to whether everyone with ADHD has the same genetic and prefrontal deficit versus maybe there's a conglomeration of things that lead to ADHD. So is it attention problems because you have anxiety or because you didn't sleep, and who calls that ADHD? And that's actually the ADHD diagnosis is usually just based on symptoms, even though there's multiple etiologies, and I'm kind of saying that one kind is more ADHD than all the rest, but actually, it's not actually true. A clinician might diagnose you with ADHD just because of your symptoms, yeah.
Research like percentages of misdiagnosed like sleep disorders. What percentage of people were diagnosed with ADHD, but in reality they just had sleep disorders, and like what that percentage range was?
I actually don't know the rate of that. I have no idea. All I know is that if you have a sleep disorder, addressing that sleep disorder might be very useful to at least mitigate those symptoms. Okay, so
part of the ADHD where people just struggle with like getting out of the house to get to work on time and things like that. Is that a huge factor?
Yeah, it's probably due to some of the same kinds of attentional issues that we're talking about. So if you get distracted and, instead of leaving the house, you decide you're going to just play one more video game. Sometimes I don't want to get out of bed until I finish the crossword puzzle. It's just, you're hyper-focused on something else, and, you're not following that sort of the steps that you need to take to get out of the house. So absolutely, you could, time management is a well-known kind of consequence of ADHD. Okay, I'm going to keep going a little bit, but you can always ask more questions. So one hypothesis that we had was that people with ADHD might have more creativity than people with ADHD. And for that, I'm gonna first talk about different kinds of creativity or measures of creativity. And it could be explained by limited attentional control. Okay, so we wanted to first show, are there differences? And we said there were differences in divergent thinking. I'm going to define that in a second. It seems to be explained by limited control, and we did that sort of statistically. It does actually make people creative in the real world and not just on our lab tasks of creativity. And there's some research on children that other people have done, but all of our work is with adults. We also have some research in which we see that people with ADHD are also better at hyperfocus or more likely to hyperfocus. And I'm going to jump there. So we already knew one thing, which is that ADHD is associated with poor inhibitory control. We also knew before we did our research that inhibition is related to creativity. So people with poor inhibition actually exhibit greater creativity, at least on divergent thinking measures. So therefore, all we did in our study was kind of draw the both sets of these links at once. So the ability to generate many ideas from one idea is what divergent thinking is. Idea generation, brainstorming, and a classic laboratory measure of of divergent thinking is the unusual uses test. So for example, how many uses can you think of for a brick? So why don't we try that now? Can people name other things that you can use a brick for? Paperweight.
Weapon.
Weapon.
You scratch it on the concrete. It can be used as like a chalk.
Chalk.
Doorstop.
Bonfire. Doorstop.
Dominoes.
Dominoes.
Make a fairy house out of it.
Fairy house.
Makeshift dumbbell.
Say that
Like a
again.
dumbbell.
Dumbbells. Use the weight. Any others?
To stand on to make you a little taller.
Stand on.
Furniture,
Furniture.
trade it for something else.
Trade it for something else.
Counterweight.
Counterweight.
A brick oven.
Brick oven. Okay, these were great responses. Convergent thinking, on the other hand, is the ability to generate one correct idea that many separate ideas or concepts share. So a classic measure of convergent thinking is the remote associates test. And in this test, you hear 3 words and you have to say what word they all have in common. So here's an example: falling, actor, dust. Good. Star. Quick coin, spoon.
Silver.
Silver. Great. Bald screech emblem.
Eagle.
Good. Note dive chair.
Pad.
High. High note, high dive, high chair. Okay. So good job. That was really good, actually. A lot of times people don't get any of them. Divergent and convergent thinking. They're both somewhat correlated with real life creativity, especially divergent thinking. And some models of creativity argue that you kind of need to be good at both in order to have some kind of creative outputs. So in the first experiment that I'm going to tell you about, we had 45 adults with ADHD and 45 adults who didn't have ADHD, and we kind of matched them on SATs and grades. So they sort of were similarly academically gifted, or sort of performed. And they all had a ADHD diagnosis by a clinician, but we also confirmed the clinical diagnosis in the lab. So they did an inhibition measure, and I'm not going to describe that inhibition measure today, but just know that we measured their inhibition. We measured divergent thinking with the unusual uses test. We measured convergent thinking with the remote associates test. And then we gave people a bunch of ADHD scales to just make sure that they had ADHD. Turns out, so this study was done a while back in Memphis, where I used to work. But when we do these studies in Ann Arbor, a large chunk of the students that claim they have ADHD don't. It's actually quite fascinating. Okay, so in the divergent thinking measure, we had them do the unusual uses test for both brick and bucket. And we calculated 3 scores. One is fluency. That's just the number of responses that people came up with. Just how many things did they say? We calculated originality. So how original were those responses? So it was far more likely that people would say use bricks to build a house or a wall than say to use it to write with like chalk. So that would get more points. And then we also measured flexibility, and that's kind of switching categories. So if you say a bunch of things that are all about building, like building a wall, building a house, building, I don't know, name another thing you could build. Brick oven, sure, thank you. That would all be like one set. And then if you switched over to something like different weapon uses, that would be another kind of thing. Or if you switched over to thinking about what things that could go in the holes, that would be another kind of category. So we counted how many category shifts they made. And so what we found is that people with ADHD generated more ideas overall. They generated more original ideas, and they were more likely to jump from one category to the next, right? So basically, their attentional control, the lesser attentional control or inhibition, kind of allows people with ADHD to stop thinking about one thing and switch to another idea quickly, because lots of things are kind of activated. So their mind wanders and doesn't focus on some narrow thing where you just keep thinking about things that are built or whatever. And here's some sample responses. People with ADHD who didn't have ADHD would often say something like build a house, build a wall, carry water, make a sandcastle for bucket. People with ADHD would say stuff like crush and make into lipstick, use to write on surfaces like concrete, use as a pencil holder, buckets, as a guitar if strings and a stick were added, as an underwater air supply, draw a face on it, put a leash on it, keep it as a pet. So you can see how these are far more original, more elaborated also than the sort of more typical responses. And what tends to happen when we do this in a group is people first start naming the typical things, and as we get further along in the conversation, people start coming up with more unique things. This is how ADHDs did relative to non-ADHDs on the convergent thinking measure. So people who did not have ADHD did better on convergent thinking. And so we also found that ADHDs did worse on the inhibition measure that we used. So we found that ADHDs were better on divergent thinking, and non-ADHDs were better on convergent thinking. And then we did a statistical analysis to basically show that inhibition kind of explained those results. But we just did these lab tasks and so we wanted to know if it had an impact on real life creativity. So we gave people a questionnaire called the Creative Achievement Questionnaire, and it basically asked for lifetime creative achievement in art science, like visual arts, culinary arts, etc. And then there would be like levels of how creative you've been in those domains. Like, I have no training or talent, I've taken lessons, people have commented on my talent, I've won prizes, I have had a showing of my work, I've sold a piece, my work has been critiqued in local publications, and it's been critiqued in national publications. So it's sort of a level of how creative you've been in these different domains. We also use something called the Foresight Thinking Profile, which assesses different thinking modes, like idea clarification, generation, idea development, idea implementation. And so I like to break a broad problem apart and examine it from all angles, would be a developer. I enjoy working on ill-defined novel problems, would be an ideator. I like to focus on creating a precisely stated problem, a clarifier, and I really enjoy implementing an idea. So which of these 4 categories do you think ADHDs are more likely to fall into? Ideator, good, yes. All right, so they got a score on each type of thinking style. So we had 28 ADHDs and non-ADHDs. We used the abbreviated Torrance test of creativity, which included things like the brick and bucket task, but also like how many things you can make with triangles, things like that. The Creative Achievement Questionnaire, the Foresight Questionnaire. And here's what we found. We found, again, the ADHDs did better. Well, this is the abbreviated Torrance test. So they did better on originality. They didn't actually do better on fluency, but that's because they got a bunch of triangles and everybody had to fill them all out. So, you know, they only got a little less if they didn't fill them all out. Elaboration, on the other hand, non-ADHDs did better. So ADHDs were more likely to think of more broader ideas, but the non-ADHDs would stick to an idea and elaborate on it a little bit. On the Foresight Thinking program profile, as you can see, you were absolutely right. The ADHDs did better on the ideation measure, and the non-ADHDs did better on the, or were more reported having a thinking profile that was more developer-like. All right, and then creative achievement. It turns out that ADHDs actually showed greater creative achievements than non-ADHDs in art, in science, in performance, and in general overall. So ADHDs not only do better on laboratory measures, but they report that they've been more successful in creative endeavors than non-ADHDs. So ADHDs outperform non-ADHDs on originality. They have greater creative achievement scores, even in college. So these were college students, so they had already achieved more. And they prefer and excel at some aspects of creative thinking, but not at others. But could this partially be explained by the fact that ADHDs just are more willing to interpret, like, I sold a piece of art. My son once sold a piece of art to someone for $1 when he was like 2. But does that count, right? So are ADHDs reporting this stuff? Or are they really more creative? So this is my favorite study of these studies. And we want to have a real life measure of creativity. And I'm going to say something about something that happened pretty much before you all were born, which is that smartphones didn't exist yet. So there was no smartphones. People just had regular old flip phones, phones that were cell phones, but they didn't allow you to do anything, had hardly any features like alarm clocks or games or other things at that time. And so we wanted to see if people could design a better cell phone for college students. And then we measured the originality of the ideas they generated, the innovativeness, so what didn't actually exist and was new, and practicality. So we had 30 of each ADHD and non-ADHD individuals. They did the cell phone task. They also did the word association task, which is one that I thought would be really cool because it sort of suggests a breadth of thinking. And in this task, you basically say the first word that comes to mind. So I always thought that's this kind of thing psychologists did, right? So if I say something like doctor, you would say, okay, see, everybody has a different word. There are some words that are more closely associated with doctor, and you can use kind of text databases to get that. So doctor and nurse are close together, but doctor and house are further apart. There's a doctor house on TV, I guess, and there's also house calls, things like that. If you said something like handwriting, like that would be an association you might have with doctors having poor handwriting on prescriptions. Also something you wouldn't know since you probably just get printouts these days. But anyway, so we could measure how far apart the words they generated were from the original word. And so what we found was ADHDs provided more innovative responses than non-ADHDs. They provided inventions that were rated as actually more practical than non-ADHDs, which we thought was really cool and unexpected. And so just to see they were more, that's actually wrong, I think. They were more original and innovative, but they were equally practical and useful. And we thought that was really good because you didn't want to just say they make up random weird ideas like, I'm going to use a cell phone as a toilet or something, right? They generated things that made sense. Okay, so here's some non-innovative ideas. A cell phone that has large font. Cell phone with a built-in alarm clock. Whereas innovative would be a cell phone that has an alarm that turns off when slowly moved 20 feet. So that's kind of an example. You can't throw it, you have to get out of bed. And then what was super cool was that how distant the words were that you generated in this word association task was related to how innovative and original your responses were. So it again suggests sort of an attentional breadth was beneficial in this case. Okay, so ADHD adults are more innovative than non-ADHD adults. And word association seems to be related to innovativeness. And I'm skipping children. I think that was from a previous talk. All right. So finally, I'm going to switch from creativity to hyperfocus. And people had sort of speculated that people with ADHD were more likely to exhibit hyperfocus. And when we started this work, no one had actually done that. Turns out someone beat us to publishing a paper, someone from Turkey. But when we first did it, there was speculation. Same with the creativity. There was kind of speculation and a little qualitative work, but no one had done sort of these studies. So we developed a scale on hyperfocus based on clinical descriptions and interviews with ADHD individuals. And we had both general questions as well as topic-specific questions, like do you ever get hyperfocus on school, hobbies, screen time? And then we examined the degree of hyperfocus and severity of ADHD symptoms. Do people who exhibit more hyperfocus also have more ADHD symptoms? And flow, which is a construct that's about getting immersed in activities, and internet addiction. Because hyperfocus can possibly be bad, right? Okay, so here's an example. Generally, when I'm very focused on something or doing something that I find especially rewarding, I might accidentally skip meals, stay up all night, or keep doing the activity until I absolutely must get up to go to the bathroom. In general, when I'm busy doing something I enjoy or something I'm very focused on, I find it very difficult to quit and move on to something else, even if I have a lot of other important things I should be doing instead. Generally, when I'm very focused on something or doing something that I find especially rewarding, I can feel totally captivated by or hooked on an activity. So in both experiments, participants filled out scales for a variety of mental health diagnoses, including ADHD, hyperfocus, flow, and internet addiction. I'm actually going to show multiple studies that so the first study had 250 participants, 23 who had official ADHD, but then we also had a continuous measure. Remember when I said that everyone kind of shows some symptoms? And so we had a continuous measure of ADHD symptomology. And then in the other study, there were ADHD, about 200 ADHDs and 200 non-ADHDs. So we really wanted to compare the two groups. All right, so this is people who had ADHD compared to people who didn't have ADHD, and their reports of hyperfocus in school, hobbies, screen time, and in general. And you can see that across the board, ADHDs report experiencing more hyperfocus. And then this is just a replication here, school, hobbies, screen time, and dispositional hyperfocus, so it's like different. Okay, and then this is the continuous data. Basically, the more symptoms people have, the worse their symptoms, the more likely they are to report hyperfocus. And so that line is people who have ADHD So they're high in the first place on the measure of ADHD. And it goes up. The higher their symptoms, the more hyperfocus they exhibit. This is people who don't have a diagnosis of ADHD, but some of them actually probably do have ADHD because they're getting right up there on the cars. And so you can see that the more symptoms you have, the more likely you are to have. This is actually one more study, and that's ADHD traits again and hyperfocus. We flipped the X and Y axis here. So that's the ADHD scale, and that is the hyperfocus scale. And then this is just the difference between people who don't have ADHD and the people who have ADHD. And you can see again that people with ADHD are more likely to report hyperfocus. So is it a good thing? Sometimes. So people with hyperfocus are more likely to exhibit internet addiction, which is, probably not a good thing. But people with hyperfocus are also more likely to have creative achievement, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to focus on doing an art project and don't want to stop, you might actually achieve more in those creative fields. So I went through a whole lot of data. And so I'm just going to sort of summarize what we found, and then I'll open up for more questions. So we found that ADHD has primarily negative consequences for education and things like social relationships and work life, because you might have trouble getting out of the house or forget your wallet at work or whatever. And so that's one side to ADHD. But on the other side, ADHD is associated with greater creativity. People with ADHD show greater rates of hyperfocus than non-ADHD, and that's sometimes a good thing, sometimes not so much a good thing, but it's still there. And these negative and positive consequences are all connected to deficits in executive attentional control and executive function. So basically, sometimes it's actually good to have lower executive control or attentional control. And I'm just going to explain again, one more reason why it might be good, and this is kind of an evolutionary explanation for ADHD. So if you live out in a world in which there's no technology and you're a hunter-gatherer, you have to focus on your task, like searching for food, but at the same time, you have to kind of be attentive to all of the different potential dangers in the environment, right? And so it's not surprising that some people, at least some people argue that some people might develop or get sort of a broader attentional focus because that was something important in their environment.
One of my first learning things in learning more about my own ADHD was an article about the Maasai people in Kenya. And they found that I think it was something close to like 45% of the people in the village qualified for ADHD. And that they found that the pattern recognition or being able to quickly discern something as out of the ordinary was extremely helpful for hunter and gatherers, and that they thought that was part of why. And I guess I'm curious if that like pattern recognition versus creativity came into play with you all at all.
That's a really good question that I actually honestly don't know the answer to. I've heard about this Maasai study, but I don't remember the pattern recognition part.
That may be another.
It could just be that I don't remember. So, other questions? Yeah.
Excuse me. You mentioned that when you conducted the same study in Ann Arbor that you had previously conducted in Memphis, you found that a lot of the subjects in the Ann Arbor study didn't turn out to have the ADHD that they climbed. Why do you think that is?
Could you repeat the question for
Yes, sure. The question was, why do I think that some people claim to have ADHD but didn't have ADHD in Ann Arbor? And I would guess there's multiple explanations for that, and I don't know the answer, so I'm only speculating. One explanation is that they had ADHD when they were younger and they've grown out of it, but they still think they have ADHD, so that's one possibility. Another possibility, which is very likely, is that they were misdiagnosed at some point, because most people don't use the sort of gold standard of diagnosing ADHD. Most kids who are diagnosed with ADHD, their mom goes to the pediatrician and says, the teacher said he's not paying attention in class, maybe he has ADHD. And at most, the pediatrician gives them a questionnaire, and that's how they're diagnosed with ADHD. So a lot of people are misdiagnosed with ADHD. And then the third most nefarious explanation is that some people want to be diagnosed with ADHD because there are benefits in schooling, things like time and a half on tests, things like that. So there may be some pushing by high SES parents, and there's some evidence for that, that parents want their kids to have the diagnosis, so then they'll have better SAT scores.
As you're talking about people who were diagnosed but maybe didn't exhibit it, and thinking about how, especially with my medication, I have like an 8-hour window where I'm like a normal person, and then the rest of the afternoon I am like half ADHD, and then me not taking my medication at all is. So I'm wondering if medication entered at all into the tests and things like that.
Yeah, so because I've done other research where we literally compared people on medication and non-medication on a bunch of ADHD tasks, and it absolutely has an impact. I have not done the creativity work with that comparison, but lots and lots of different kinds of attention studies that we've done in my lab where medication has a meaningful positive impact. It turns out that it also has a somewhat positive impact on people who don't have ADHD, which is why there's some abuse of these medications. And they do have side effects, so people shouldn't be taking them without doctor's supervision. Just saying. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, right. So we've actually done it different ways in different studies, but the very first gross level way we did it is we counted how many times someone said something. So if only 1 out of 60 people had said use it for lipstick, then it got, I think we just created a ratio like 60/1. So if 100% of people said it, it would be like 60/60. So you just get 1 point. If 1 person said it, you would get 60 points because we just did that quantification. We later actually created a giant database of people's responses. So we had a much more sophisticated, large database of responses to these questions. So we really knew how common they were, and not just in our small samples. Yeah.
How is ADHD diagnosed?
Oh, that is a good question. And it is actually the sort of gold standard is using a structured clinical interview, which involves asking a series of questions and follow-up questions by a trained clinician. It helps to have, in addition, both parent reports and teacher reports. So you would interview the kid, you would interview the parent, you would give the teacher a questionnaire, and then it's especially helpful, but rarely done, which is to add some neuropsych testing. So actually having people do these kinds of attention tasks. Like there's something called the continuous performance test, which is one where you see letters on a screen and you just push a button every time you see a letter, but you don't push a button when you see an X. And it turns out ADHDs are both more likely to push a button when they see the X, but also more likely to miss a letter that appears on the screen because they're distracted. So there's kind of a continuum of how to diagnose ADHD. ideally, you would do all of those things, and also show that there's some impact of how you did on everyday life. So that's another one. And so there's a bunch of criteria in the DSM-5 of symptoms that the structured clinical interview sort of asks. Yeah.
I know that you said. I know you said that you did these studies on mostly college kids. Have you done any longitudinal studies to see if these kind of remain the same throughout life into like older adulthood?
Really good question, and no, we haven't. It would be really cool. And you know, when you're young and you're publishing papers, you don't think you're ever going to be able to do a longitudinal study. But when you get to be my age, I'm like, why didn't I do this for the last 20 years, right? Like, so right now I'm doing some longitudinal studies in my lab with the recognition that actually this career is a long time, and maybe I could do some longitudinal studies, but I haven't yet.
Hello? I'm just thinking about the U of M study again, and it just makes me think too of all the people that self-diagnose them, just when I'm thinking about like social media and how many people have their platforms on there talking about their life as ADHD. And then you look at the comments and like everybody is like, "Oh yeah, I definitely have it too, me too." Like, and I feel like so even like a lot of my friends, I hear themselves talking to them like saying they have ADHD and like they exhibit a lot of the symptoms but have never been like actually diagnosed for it. So I feel like a lot of people just assume that for themselves too.
I think you're absolutely right that people self-diagnose with ADHD and then they just tell their doctor they have ADHD and the doctor's like, okay. And right now on TikTok, there's tons of videos where someone will say something like, I do X and I realize now that it's due to my ADHD, and all these other people say, I do X too, you know, like I twiddle my thumbs or whatever it is. And there's a lot of misinformation about ADHD out on TikTok and other social media sites. And just one symptom is just not possibly a diagnosis of ADHD. But I've heard that this is true, and there's some studies on analyzing the misinformation on TikTok.
I was just going to add to that and say, so my partner, who's now 37, got diagnosed 5 years ago. He was diagnosed as a kid with OCD, and he went to Catholic school, so they missed a lot of things in the diagnosis process when he was younger, and has benefited greatly from actually finding out a diagnosis at a later age and medication for his general work life. But yeah, he was misdiagnosed with OCD at a young age, which I thought was interesting add on to that.
Yeah, totally. So people are misdiagnosed, and I think there's also like class and racial bias with these kinds of things. Like the same kid who gets up to sharpen the pencil because they can't sit still could be diagnosed as oppositional defiant disorder or ADHD, and so there's so much bias in the diagnostic world. There's also a lot of comorbidity between all of these different things, which means that people who have ADHD are more likely to have autism and vice versa. OCD is another one where you're more likely to have both. Anxiety is another one where you're more likely to have both. Yeah.
Yeah. So is this even? Oh, there it is. Okay. So you just said about comorbidity between ADHD and autism, and I know that there has been a lot going on with linking those as both sort of neurodivergent. I know that autism is not your emphasis, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the links between ADHD and autism and what that means to be neurodivergent in general.
Good question. So the idea behind the term neurodivergent is the idea that people are just different, but not that one is worse or better. And the data that we have here suggests that, right? Like you're better at some stuff, worse at some stuff. It's not like a uniform bad thing, right? And possibly the reason that it even comes out as bad is because we do lots of things that are abnormal for human beings to do, right? Like sit still all day. You know, 8-year-olds having to sit still for 8 hours a day is not something that's something natural for a child. And so it's not surprising then that when we think of ADHD, we think of some of the negative consequences. But in fact, if you think about it as a neurodivergence, it's like a different set of skills that are equally potentially beneficial. And people also view autism in the same way, at least in autism spectrum. So there are some individuals with really severe autism, like nonverbal and stuff, and maybe not these individuals, but people who have other symptoms of autism. One is hyperfocus. They're more likely to exhibit hyperfocus. If they're really motivated or interested in something, they're really likely to focus really hard on it, just like the ADHDs. And we actually did have that data. So comorbidities, there's multiple reasons why there might be comorbidities. Autism also impacts prefrontal function. Yeah, I don't know too much about autism, but I do know that there's some evidence of higher creativity and some evidence of better visuospatial thinking. And poorer verbal skills. So there's, again, kind of a trade-off, which is why people think of autism as another potential neurodivergent kind of condition. Yeah.
I kind of mentioned it earlier on. I was always under the impression that neurodivergence, or ADHD specifically, is a very small percentage. Um, what what is the percentage of ADHD, the world's population with ADHD diagnosis?
In the United States, it's about 11%. I think worldwide, it's like slightly lower than that. Probably in part because in some places they actually have school that's really different. In different cultures, you may not sort of exhibit some of the symptoms.
I just wanted or it just seems very evident in social media that almost everybody has ADHD now. So, it is only 11% of the population that is.
Yes. I mean, as of now. Yeah.
Is to manage ADHD symptoms?
I am not familiar with other kinds of medications or not neurotropic substances, I guess, and how they impact ADHD. I think, I'm not even going to speculate because I don't want to accidentally say something wrong.
Like studies from different areas, regions, and like colleges. Is there a correlation of people who, like, is there differences between the regions is what I'm asking. Like people, example, Ann Arbor versus Memphis, or at different colleges, and would it be worth cutting out that variability and focusing on one area or region for future studies, or is that like, is there really no?
Those are really good questions, and it partially depends on whether you want to generalize to a broader population, right? So you need a broader population in your study in order to generalize to people in general. So some of our studies are only really applicable to the kinds of people that have been in our studies, right? You can't really technically generalize. Some statisticians argue that you should do lots of these studies in individual kinds of regions. And then others say that you should have, more people say you should have like just a broadest swath possible. So a lot of our studies now we try to do online so that we can recruit people from all over the place, stuff like that, so that we do get, and there are some regional differences. I happened to look on the CDC site when I was getting some of these slides together, and they have some maps that show where like they're darker, the more ADHD in a particular state. And so there do seem to be some differences, and it's not clear why. It may have to do with completely extraneous factors like access to medical care or something like that. So, yeah.
So,
I did see that one of the
experiments that you did started in 2022, but did you start any of this before COVID? Like, was there any impact on that to like the attention span? Just because like there was also like that lack of school and like ability to focus in a classroom because of that. Did that have like anything to do with the studies?
That's a really good question, and some of our all of our creativity stuff that I presented was before COVID. The Hyperfocus, I think the first studies were actually collected before COVID. They were published later. So I have not looked at changes in attention. I actually think that there's been more speculation than there's been research in this area. I once tried to look it up recently, and first of all, no one tested the same kids before and after COVID to see what kinds of changes might have happened. So other people speculate that using social media or being on phones reduces your attentional abilities. I personally don't think there's a lot of evidence supporting any of that, but that doesn't mean it's not true. I just don't think that people have studied that very well. Yeah, I don't see any more questions.
Could we give Dr. Shah a big round of applause? Thank you so much.